Okay, hello everyone. So I think we can get started. Looks like people have mostly started to join, so I think that's good. Welcome again to the course, and I just have a few announcements before we get started. So just to go over the program again, today is the day that we're talking all about implementation. So we're going to start off with holding the project startup kickoff meeting. And then the next session will be all about agreements, work plans, budgets, and subawards. And then the next session will be issues that you deal with in project implementation, adaptive management, and impact evaluation. And then finally, we will wrap things up with financial management, grant management, and also reporting. So these are things that, all the things that we have to worry about when we're implementing a project. So I just have a few announcements. First of all, you should have all received a link to the Google Drive. We will drop it in the chat again today, and we will drop the program in the chat as well, in case you didn't see that. And all of the English presentations are available in that Google Drive. So not only for today's session and yesterday's session, but also tomorrow's session. And for session 8 and 9, we also have French and Spanish versions of the presentations available, and the other languages for the other presentations will be available later after we get them translated. So we're also doing video recordings in English and Spanish and French, and I believe you all were able to choose which interpretation option you wanted at the bottom of the screen. And if you have problems with that, feel free to reach out to us and we will help you. But we have recorded those as well, and those are in the Google Drive. And for the Spanish ones, we've broken it down by session, and we will do that for the other recordings as well at some point, not right away, probably. So that's that. We also uploaded the chat from yesterday and a question and answers document. And I wanted to say, going back through the chat yesterday, I noticed that a lot of the messages were to the hosts and panelists and not to everyone. And that's because the chat has that as the default. So if you want to make sure your message goes to everyone, make sure you select that option in the chat. I know that we were doing it as well as panelists, so it's a reminder for everybody to make sure that you're selecting the right audience for your chat message. And we are, like I said, putting everything in the Google Drive for now, but we are also going to set up a space on the PlantVillage website where all the recordings and documents will live eventually, not right away. We'll try to get that done as soon as possible. But that website also has a feature where you can interact with each other and ask questions. So that will be how we continue this beyond this course. And finally, I have a note for the panelists. I may remind you again later, but please remember to speak, if not slowly, at least not quickly, because we are doing the live interpretation, and we want to make sure that the interpreters can catch everything we're saying and be able to translate it live to the people on the Spanish and French channels. So those are all of my announcements. And with that, I think we will dive into our next session. So because I'm hosting, I may not see your chat. I do have some people who are helping. We have Renee here who's helping, and the panelists have also been very helpful to me. So I apologize if I don't respond directly to your chat message. That's just why. It's not personal. Okay, so let me get the screen up. All right, please let me know if you have any trouble seeing anything. Our first session today, like I said, is holding the project startup or kickoff meeting. And let's see. Our panelists today, we are welcoming Dr. Deanna Bering. She is an assistant dean and director of Ag Sciences Global and is responsible for leading and coordinating Penn State's College of, which college is that? Sorry.
Ag Sciences.
Ag Sciences. Okay, I'm sorry. That should have clicked. Of International Research, Educational, and Outreach Programs. And she has served in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the Department of Commerce, and USAID. She has a much longer bio, but that is a shorter one for this slide. We are also welcoming back Annalise Keys from the lab from yesterday, if you remember her. She's the operations director of PlantVillage and the Current and Emerging Threats to Crops Innovation Lab. Her background is in agricultural and biological engineering with a focus on food and bioprocesses and international agriculture. And we also have Dr. Kurt Richter from Michigan State University. He's an associate professor in the Department of Community Sustainability. He's the director for the Global Center for Food Systems Innovation, the Innovation Scholars Program, and the Grain Research and Innovation programs here at MSU. And he has over 25 years of experience in international development and has managed over $100 million in USAID funded projects around the world. So with that, I will welcome them. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. So amazing to see so many people on this workshop. Congratulations to all of you for being part of this really cool program. It's quite a reach that you're all having around the world, and I'm really excited to be just a small part of it. So my colleagues, Kurt and Annalise, and I decided we would do this in an informal roundtable type of setting. So we're just going to use these slides as a way to have a conversation with each other. So picture us, actually we all have hopefully our coffee mugs, and we're having a chat with you about about the importance of kickoff meetings. And before we get started, I just want to say, and you all know this, and I think, huge credit to the management team for this particular innovation lab. Successful projects don't just happen, right? They depend critically on good project management, and that's what you're going to spend all day doing today, right? But one of the key things for good project management, not surprising, is what we're talking about right now, the kickoff meeting, right? The first meeting with the project team and client. So, Kurt, Annalise, what would you add to that?
Thanks, Dan. I think that, the kickoff meeting to me is your first opportunity to begin to learn how to be a team. Typically, when you start a kickoff meeting, you have a new group of people, you have a new consortium. Even if you have an old consortium in a new place, you're learning how to work together. And the kickoff meeting to me is really important because I learn how to work with my new partners. And I also get a chance to celebrate the fact that we're doing something amazing. The excitement and enthusiasm for our work is never higher than when it is at the kickoff meeting. Now, if everything goes right, when you close out, it'll also be extremely high, but you're going to have ups and downs. So this is when you can get together with your donor or your partners and really celebrate what you're going to do. And so to me, there's two sides. There's the actual event that is a celebration, and then there's the work, which is a great time to really learn how to work together as a team. So those are my two big overarching comments. And if you take nothing else away from me today, please take that away, okay? And I'll turn it back over.
I like your idea of having the enthusiasm carry through from this meeting. And I think to me, the kickoff meetings are really about taking this time to have a relaxed and focused environment to start those relationships with both your team and your donor and whoever else may be in that meeting. This is the first of many meetings you're going to have with these people at different times. And the majority of the meetings coming after won't have this time to just kind of get to know each other's personalities and make sure you are aligning on different, visions and goals and really just brainstorming, even though you already have your project set. And the meetings down the line will be based on technical updates and any challenges that come up. And so they may not have that enthusiastic environment, but this is a great way to bring that into your project to start. And I think that the other important thing to note here is in the past 2-3 years now, we've really shifted to kickoff meetings being on Zoom as opposed to being in person. And that is a very different feeling than when you are in person and everyone gets to travel. So you also have to make that enthusiasm a little bit, because if you're not traveling to go somewhere new, or you're not traveling with your team and have that encouraging environment just by being in person and having that energy that you feel, you kind of have to work a little harder on Zoom to create that. And so don't let that fall through the cracks just because we are on Zoom.
So yeah, before we go to the next slide, I always like to ask the opposite question, right? So this question you have here, what is a kickoff meeting, right? So, but what is it not, right? It is not a time for like information broadcast, like Annalise said, that all should have happened before. You know what the project is, but it's really a time to engage, right? I always like to think too, what would happen if you didn't have a kickoff meeting, right? Think about how confused people would be, the lack of connection, the drift that might occur, right? The problems you might have when stumbling blocks do come up. As Kurt and Annalise said, through the project, there will be ups and downs. So without that kickoff meeting, establishing those partnerships, it's the good time now, but when the bad times might come, and they probably might, you already then have those relationships and that trust and that communication so that you can get through those bad times as well as celebrate the good times. So I always like to say, well, what if we didn't do it? What is it not? I always ask the inverse question, and that helps you think about, the value that a kickoff meeting or whatever it is brings. So should we go to the next slide, Kurt and Annalise? Do you think we're ready? Okay. So we talked kind of in concept what the kickoff meeting is, but we also thought it would be helpful to talk about what some of the key elements of a successful kickoff meeting are, right? Introductions. This is a big team, right? And so getting to know everyone, is important, but will take a while. And so you need to set aside time to do that. Setting the context or the background. And Kurt mentioned in his comments earlier, and I'm going to let him jump in here. Sometimes a kickoff meeting has the client with you, in this case, USAID, and sometimes it might not. So depending on your project or what you're trying to do, you may or may not have your client with you. But background and context are really important things to cover when you have your client with you, because in this case, USAID knows kind of what the context is for this particular innovation lab, but that could be the case on any other kind of project. So when you have your client with you, make sure to set aside time for really setting the context and background and to hear from your client on those things. So Kurt, you've had 100 million with USAID, so I'm going to punt it back to you to see if I'm right or if you have other thoughts.
Yeah, it's really, working with USAID, and this is as you can tell, my primary source of external funding has been AID. There's been others, but AID, the kickoff meeting is important for AID because they need the opportunity to showcase what they're trying to do. And they need the opportunity to go out and really engage with beneficiaries early on. Oftentimes, They put elaborate work into writing the proposal, collecting information, writing the RFA, collecting information, drafting the document that we then respond to. And there could be months to go from when they write the RFA to when you are having a kickoff meeting. We're currently getting ready to launch a new project in Malawi, and it's been over a year since we've written the first concept note to implementation starting. So this is a great opportunity for AID to come out and meet with people you're working with, yourself, your team, your beneficiaries. And that is one of the most important things, is make sure you create space in your kickoff meeting for your beneficiaries to meet with your donor. They'll meet with you. Don't worry about it. You'll have lots of interactions with them. But make sure there's time for somebody like USAID can sit down and talk with the people who they have designed the program to directly benefit. And let them have conversations. Let them have conversations about the work you're going to do, about the work they want you to do, and also about the work that needs to be done outside the scope of this project. This conversation can be great at framing the information AID has around about the work that they're going to have you do, or any donor has you do. And so don't be afraid of having your donors sit down with your beneficiaries and talking. This signals you have you're honoring a transparent process. You're open to feedback, and you want your donor to engage with people who they're only going to really get a chance to engage with, maybe at the kickoff meeting, maybe at a midterm evaluation, and maybe at the project closeout. So don't be afraid to have your donor sit down with your local beneficiaries and have a conversation. Back to you, Deanna.
Yeah, thanks so much. Annalise, do you want to kind of add to any of that and kind of maybe talk us through some of the other points that people see on the screen? Just get us started or continue the conversation.
Certainly. So I think when I consider what are the key elements of a kickoff, the importance that all of these different bullet points really come back to, and that Kurt was getting at as well, is just that general communication factor. This is a time to really outline what you're going to do in more specific detail. And I see some questions coming in the chat on how does honoring local protocols fit in here? And I think that it is a unique one for us to include in the key elements of a kickoff, but it is important because this is a time, as we've stated, that all of your team and your clients and stakeholders are in this meeting. And it's also a good point to get everyone on the same page and make sure that the important topics or aspects of the project are very out in the open and have a solid foundation amongst everyone there to understand how this project is going to move forward. And honoring local protocols is a very important aspect about that, because you want everyone on your team to be focused on and aware of the local protocols that are existing in the space you'll be working in, and then also to ensure that your donors know you are also thinking about what those local protocols are. And that can include, involving the local community members. It can include including your stakeholders, or even indicating that you intend to do a survey or get feedback from from the people and communities you're going to be working with on a local basis.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I saw the questions in the chat about that. I think what's interesting is a lot of the literature, if you will, or the articles about kickoff meetings, a lot assume a very kind of monoculture, right? Traditional, as you said earlier, Annalise, face-to-face meetings, maybe everybody sitting around a table, maybe everybody's on the same time zone from similar, backgrounds. And so I think for us to really think about a successful kickoff meeting in an international context, we have to give a shout out to, the way things are done in different places. right? The comfort levels of different cultures in terms of communicating in different ways. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, I think, on the next slide. Anything else? I see there's
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to answer David's question about examples of local honor protocols. We take our teams, when we have a kickoff meeting, we really turn the local protocols over to our local partners. Let them define what the local protocols are. It's not about MSU saying, oh, we have to do it this way. Decisions around who sits at the head table, who's introduced first, who makes sure I actually have my local partner write my introductions to my speeches, so I know I am saying and acknowledging everybody that needs to be acknowledged in the room in the proper order. I've learned that I just can't get up there and say, hey, welcome everybody, we're at a kickoff meeting. That's not the way it's done in many places. I let the local partner determine, who do I think first? Are my titles correct? And then make sure that I acknowledge everybody who's on the sort of the head table at the front of the room. But then I make sure I mention and honor not only my team, but the local nationals who are helping my local partners be successful. And once we sort of set up the protocols that way, I always make space that I acknowledge the admin assistant. I acknowledge even the driver who got me there, because this might be the only time these individuals get recognized. And never forget that part of your job is to build your teamwork, making sure people enjoy working with you, like working with you, and little things like that go a long ways. And so every country I work in has a slightly different way they approach introductions. I don't try to do that myself. I create space and then let my local partners say, how do I do this? Be humble in the approach and say, who do I think first? I make sure I understand and I can pronounce the names, which I personally really struggle with in some of these countries I work in. And so I try to make sure I get the names right, the titles right, and the order right. So that's one of the things that I do with protocol. Is it takes more effort than it does. It takes a lot of effort for me to get us right. And I've learned that from being unsuccessful. I've left people off. I've forgotten people. And so that's a one little tidbit of advice I have for you.
I love that. Now I see why you're so successful. Sorry, Annalise, I cut you off, please.
Nope, no worries. I really appreciate that comment, Kurt. Thank you. I think that was a unique way to include honoring local protocols in a kickoff meeting, especially from that perspective. And I do have an example from working on the ground perspective, where in our own innovation lab kickoff meeting, we have our one partner, which is the Dream Team Agro Consultancy. Mainly the project for them is based in Kenya at the moment, and the project is to work with over 2,000 farmers to scale up an IPM project to test whether IPM can be done at scale with 5 different packages. And the interesting thing was to look at it from a data perspective on how they're going to achieve reaching these 2,000 farmers right before the lead up to one season, and then how it's actually done. Because when you look at it from a data perspective, you could say, oh, well, you can meet with 20 farmers a day, and then we can get this done, depending on how many people you have, less than 100 days. That sounds good. And then, but when we were talking about it and just having a very open, encouraging conversation, at some point the leads would stand up and say, yeah, that's not possible, because every farmer we meet with, we have to greet them. There's this formal way to have that initial conversation, have a short chat, ask how their family's doing, and then we get into the business of it. And so just incorporating that local protocols part, we're coming from outside of the country we're not familiar with. But in that space, it was very important for them to stand up and say, nope, this is how we do things from this cultural aspect, and we need to include it in the project. And that was fine. And that's the way we went. And it took a little longer. It was a little bit harder, but at the end of the day, it was much more productive. And we have a greater relationship with the farmers because of it.
I love that. It probably influenced your, let's see, the third bullet, right? The timeline, right? So you, in that kickoff meeting, because you learned about those local protocols, you probably had to adjust your timeline a little bit. So great example. Let's see, I think we should go to the next slide, and then I think it's our last kind of overview slide, and then maybe get into some really hard nuts and bolts examples from Kurt and Annalise. But and we touched on this at the very beginning. I think Kurt and Annalise did a really good job about talking about the kickoff meeting as a way to set the tone for team building and communication. I just want to add one aspect, and Annalise already mentioned this a bit, because in this day and age, right, we are working in a much different environment than we were even a few years ago, right? So the good news is we have all this technology at our fingertips to help us with these things. We're not necessarily all together face to face. So we have, you know, texting opportunities, or, you know, whatever, you know, technology variation of chat or Slack or whatever. We have email. We have phone calls, and we have what we're doing now, video. And I just want to say a word about that. And it relates to kind of the multicultural aspects of what we do in our work every day. And this is what my PhD research is on, so please forgive me. But a lot of people think always that face-to-face and video is better because you can see me expressing, right? All these cues, my enthusiasm, right? But what research will show you is that's not always the best way to be inclusive, right? Because you have these multicultural and gender issues that affect participation and inclusion. And so sometimes all I want to say here is that, and we're doing it now with chat, you will see more participation from people who might be less dominant, less inclined to speak out, can participate because we have that chat function on, right? We capture it and we use it. And so I think in this day and age, we have the best of both worlds, where you can see the visual aspect in your kickoff meeting with the enthusiasm, right? But you also have the chat, which allows for more participation and more ideas. And that means more creativity and more satisfaction. Anyway, so I just wanted to say one more word about the importance of thinking about the technology, because it is a factor in the success of your team, and not just the management tool. I mean, the communication tool. So that's all I'm going to say on this slide. Do either one of you want to add to that or take it to the next slide?
A wonderful job condensing your dissertation down into like 2 minutes. It was fantastic.
Thank you, Kurt.
No, I don't have anything to add. So
okay.
No,
So, and Annalise, I suspect
excellent.
you might be talking about management tools maybe later. I know you're like a whiz at some of those things. So, Kurt, I think the next slide is maybe talking about an example that you had at Michigan State, right? Should we go to the next slide? Okay, and then next slide too. There we go. Now we're on. Did we lose Kurt?
I was muted. I don't know why. So I'm back.
Great.
All right. Sorry about that. I'm going to give a brief example of what we did at Michigan State University. And this is for a project we had in Malawi, started in 2018. And it was a relatively small project. So it's a 1 year, it ended up being a 2-year, $1 million program funded by the United States Agency for International Development out of DC. But when I talk to this example, I want you to listen for things we talked about. Listen for examples of team building. Listen for examples of local protocol. Listen for examples of doing all the nuts and bolts that AID needed. So I'm going to be pretty quick because you not really want to. You're not here to listen to me. So next slide, please. So the major elements, I break it down into 4 groups. There's everything you do before you show up for the meeting. And then there's everything you do right before the meeting happens, all those details. There's the actual launch event itself. And then there's also the post-launch details. In American English, we have a way of calling it, we mop it up. We go in and we clean up everything and tie it up with a nice bow. So next slide, please. The next, the major goals for the launch are USAID needs a chance to celebrate the launch of a new program. You'll often hear people say we need to give them a splash, press release, photos, videos, something to document the project start. It's important that you showcase your partners. It's not about if you are the prime. I feel it's your responsibility as the prime to make sure your partners have a chance to shine in front of their peers, in front of the local donors. And you also want to show USAID that you can do the work, that you can organize, that you can pull off an event, that you can manage the details behind it. And finally, I think this is the most important, is it's a chance for you to learn how to work as a team. I have always found value in the challenges of doing a kickoff event. I've never walked away from one. It's like, wow, we really need to do that differently, or I didn't learn anything. I always learned something. So look for learning opportunities. Next slide, please. So your pre-launch planning is super important. Our team, we plan our launch activities down to the minute. We have a sheet that we use where every person who talks gets a specific amount of time. Now, because of local protocols, we don't always hold everybody to that specific amount of time, but my team knows exactly what the flow is going to be, who's going to talk, and when they're going to talk, and what they're going to talk about. The other thing we do is we take a lot of time writing official letters to invite the right people to the room. It could be that I've invited presidents of countries before, vice presidents, ministries of education, USAID, all those folks. There's a local protocol involved around doing that. We turn that over to our local partners to help craft that. But the letters often are signed by myself as the PI or my vice chancellor at the university I'm working with, or the in-country lead that we're working with. Let them do that. And finally, we often have long conversations about selecting a location. People have opinions about space, about hotels, about the food at the hotels, about the service of the hotels. It's important for you to listen to your partners and pick a place that they are comfortable with. Next slide, please. I mentioned AID needs a splash. And here's an example of a full page article that we paid for to put in the local newspaper in Malawi about a launch event. Make sure your planning involves time and your budget has funds for communication. There needs to be money in your budget for press releases or having reporters come on, those sorts of things to get that splash. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier about conversations. This is the mission director for Malawi on the right talking with the vice chancellor of Must University on the left. This was a very important conversation. I don't know what they talked about. It wasn't my business. I did take the photo and walked away because I wanted to capture this moment, because this is where our local partners had an opportunity to talk directly with the donor. Vitally important. And don't try to insert yourself as the prime implementer into this conversation. Let it happen organically and let it be between the two of them. And my final slides are, next slide, please, are about what I call look for the unexpected. When I work on a launch event in a country, I always make sure I have additional funds available to handle things that I could not expect. This is an airline ticket that I had to pay for a group of people to fly from a long way down to Blantyre, Malawi. I made the mistake of making an assumption that local transportation would be available. Well, when I got to Malawi, I found out it was not. I had to have these people at Blantyre. And the only way to get them there in time was to buy an airline ticket. And so you have to keep one eye open for things that you're not planning on and be prepared to pivot. Next slide, please. This is proof that I'm a millionaire in Malawi, in Kwacha. What I ended up doing is I always have additional funds available for cash flowing institutions, activities that I cannot, that my local partners are unable to do, and we don't have the systems in place to do it. Typically, a launch event's at the very beginning of your program, and you may not have a sub-award in place yet. You may not have the financial systems in place yet, but you're going to need to rent a ballroom at a fancy hotel. You're going to need to buy lunch. And your only mean to do that may be you as the prime who has the funding to pay for those expenses directly. Once again, look for the unexpected, but use the unexpected activities as an opportunity to build your team. Don't take it over. Let the people who can solve the problem. You just grease the skids, allow it to happen when you have the opportunity to step in and do it. I think that this is my most important part as the implementer for the kickoff event, is learning how to be a better team and learn from the small challenges. So when you have the bigger challenges during implementation, you're prepared to take them on. So I'm done. I'll turn it back to Deanne.
I think that's great. I think one thing that I've also seen in the project kickoff literature and articles I've read is that nobody actually sets aside time for a session on what might go wrong. I think people are afraid to talk about in their project planning what might go wrong. But I actually think it might be an interesting thing to include in a project kickoff meeting is a session on what might go wrong. So I love your example. And Kurt, you got a lot of laugh crying emojis during your presentation. I don't know if you saw. People are very impressed with your millionaire status. So
good.
Yeah. Annalise, I know we didn't give you time. Oh, and David Hughes just put something called pre-mortem in the chat. That might be a good agenda item. Annalise, do you want to say anything about project management tools? Because I think that's a really important thing for a project kickoff meeting to select and to spend some time making sure that the team all understands the project management software or approaches.
Certainly. So I think including project management tools in this last portion here is really important, especially coming off of Kurt's example there, where you're talking about you're providing your goals and expectations up front. And I think that's important to include ahead of time as well, before the kickoff meeting. And one of the ways you can do that is through the project management tools that you use and your team will use. And so this is a time where I know that what our innovation lab uses, OKRs, it was mostly unfamiliar to our partners, and we'd spend a lot of time building up the guides and tutorials to send them out ahead of time so they can be brought up to speed, but then also taking the time in the kickoff meeting to go over that process, allow it just an open conversation for questions. And usually it's just about, how sometimes edge cases get put in, how would we use this if this were to happen? Or if I were to experience this situation, how can I use this tool to best help me and update my partners as well? And so you can incorporate and intertwine your project management tools into your kickoff meeting through each aspect of it when you're talking about your goals, your expectations, how you're going to honor local protocols, the timelines and deliverables. Your tool can be really integrated into each of those steps. And then by the end of the kickoff meeting, everyone should be familiar with the tool you're using because you used it as an example and to guide your process throughout the whole way.
That's great. Since Kurt and I have been doing this for decades, we've seen the evolution of project management tools. 20 years ago, there wasn't much to really accessible to help. And so I remember, some very primitive tools that we used early on, nothing like what you guys are using now, Annalise, and it's very impressive.
And Annalise, what's an example of a tool that you are using? You mentioned OKRs. Would you explain to people what they are, then an example of the tool that you use to actually implement your OKR program?
Absolutely. So I saw the question in the chat. I was just about to respond, but I'll be in a session, not the next one. It's session 7 at 8:35, where I'll go into detail about how we use OKRs, what they are defined, how they're defined, and how we use them for all of our projects. But just in a quick summary, OKRs stand for objectives and key results. So our objectives are the goals that we want to achieve, and the key results are how we're going to achieve our goals. And I'll specifically talk about the importance of focusing on what you're measuring with your key results when aligning with your objectives, and how you can set short-term and long-term objectives for the entire length of your proposal. Regardless if it's a 6-month project or a 5-year project, OKRs can be used and adapted for each case. And what's really beneficial is that all partners can be using the OKRs, and they can have a waterfall effect, meaning you can have your top level goal, which is the proposal or goal of the project, but it will flow down at each stage of the intensity of the work and how local. So you can go from a really top level goal all the way down to the local level of how you're going to achieve the work. But like I said, I'll get into that in about an hour or so.
Okay, great. Maybe I'll stick around and listen to that. I learned something.
Thank you, guys. So sorry to cut you off, but I think we're at the end of our time for this session. Again, we'll have some questions that might come through. So I don't know if you guys have time to stick around and maybe answer some of the questions that come through in the chat or in the Q&A box. But if so, that would be very helpful. But if not, I guess we will move on to our next session. And thank you so much for a very informative session. And I do apologize. I realized that there was some kind of black box hovering the screen, and I have no idea what that was because everything was the same as yesterday. So I'm going to try to fix that for the next session, but I may have to be doing some things with my screen in order for it to go away. We don't want anything to block your view of the presentation when we're giving it. So thank you very much, Deanna, Kurt, and Annalise, and we will see Annalise later.